A renewed crackdown against the opposition in Bahrain. The kingdom's most prominent Shia cleric is stripped of his citizenship. Could this add to regional tensions? Also on today's program, the millions of children forced to work. Why child labor is still a global problem despite efforts to stop the practice. And in Picture This, a controversial figure takes office in the Philippines. Rodrigo Duterte is sworn in as president, vowing to crack down on crime and corruption. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Ever since 2011, at the height of the Arab Spring, the Sunni rulers of Bahrain have faced an opposition intent on seeing more jobs, political reforms and greater human rights. Protesters from the Shia majority took their demands to the streets before the security services rolled in and made arrests. Saudi Arabia helped to silence the protests by sending tanks and troops to its neighbour. 5 years on, the kingdom seems to be cracking down again on the opposition. Earlier this month, the Justice Ministry banned the main opposition party, al-Wefaq. And last week, a leading Shia cleric was stripped of his citizenship, accused of promoting sectarianism and violence. Iran has warned this decision could trigger armed resistance. But is the Gulf state a victim of tensions between regional rivals Saudi Arabia and Iran? Our newsmaker today is Bahrain, as we ask what's behind the recent opposition clampdown.
It was, according to Iran, a red line crossed. Bahrain's decision to strip a leading Shia cleric of his citizenship after a renewed crackdown on dissent. Sheikh Issa Qasim is the spiritual head of the kingdom's Shia community.
We're obviously alarmed by today's decision to revoke the citizenship of Shia cleric Sheikh Issa Qasim. We are unaware of any credible evidence to support this action.
Bahrain is an island nation. It's home to the largest US fleet in the region. It has a majority Shia population of some 70%, but the ruling monarchy is Sunni. The treatment of Issa Qasim is stirring the hornet's nest. He remains barricaded at his home in the capital Manama, but this is a small part of the tensions at play in the area. Bahrain has had years of unrest, the Shia majority protesting long and hard against their Sunni rulers. But are their problems a microcosm of the other conflicts and proxy wars across the region? The struggle between the Shia and Sunni regimes across the Gulf states is widespread, primarily dominated by two major players, fighting for control and influence, and have been for decades. Saudi Arabia, with its majority Sunni population, opposed by the Shia majority in Iran. The struggle between the two powers has spread a long way beyond their respective borders. Iran has long been a backer of Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad. It causes great irritation to the Saudi rulers.
Unless we change the balance of power on the ground in a dramatic way, that once we do that, it will open the way for a political settlement.
Iran is often accused of undue influence and causing unrest in Bahrain and the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, while its backing of the Houthi rebels in the war in Yemen gives it influence on the southern Saudi border. For Saudi Arabia, what happens there is a matter of grave national security. Tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia have been ratcheted up to another level in recent months. On January the 2nd, Saudi Arabia executed 47 people convicted of being terrorists, including a prominent Shia cleric, Neighbour al-Neighbour. It caused widespread protest in the Shia world. The Saudi Arabian embassy in Iran was torched, while violent demonstrations broke out in Bahrain. The Bahraini treatment of Sheikh Issa Qasim has added to the anger. He's been accused by the government of promoting sectarianism and violence. They've also suspended the main opposition group, al-Wefaq. The current uneasy calm in Bahrain may well be shattered by events beyond its border. But is Bahrain the creator of its own issues, or a pawn in a far larger game? Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the situation in Bahrain is Mohammad Marandi. He's an associate professor at the University of Tehran. And in London, we have Sabah al Mukhtar. He's the president of the UK's Arab Lawyers Association. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Sabah al Mukhtar, let me start with you. Francis posed an interesting question in that report. Is Bahrain really a microcosm of this Cold War between Saudi and Iran and the sectarianism that we see in the region between Sunni and Shia? Or is it a country with its own independent, organic problems that has little to do with the bigger picture?
No, I think it's part of the whole system, but I think one must start by condemning the idea of withdrawing nationality of citizens or residents in countries. This is contrary to international law, it's contrary to the human rights, and it cannot be accepted under any circumstances. However, that must not detract from the idea that the issues in Bahrain should be examined objectively. I think the situation in Bahrain, it's not a Shia Sunni one. It's the normal situation where you have a dictatorship, that the people have rose against it. But it so happened that the majority of those who have risen are Shiites. You have the same problem in other countries, but not necessarily labeled as such in a sectarian way. I think this idea that it's a problem between the Shiites and Sunni is really a manufactured example of how you label problems in that region.
Okay, but
I don't think it's
let me ask you, sorry to interrupt you, let me ask you, the revoking the citizenship of Sheikh Isa Qasim, do you think that it was a sectarian move by the monarchy?
No, I don't think so. I think if this gentleman was in Europe, even in Britain, he would have been probably charged with either terrorism or at least with trying to provoke sectarian ideas or trying to provoke the division within the nationality, within the nation. In Bahrain, this gentleman, the pronouncements, the speeches he makes, it challenges the rule of the monarchy. It says that people should follow what the clerics say, absolute obedience to the clerics, which is the wilayat al-faqih concept. The second thing is that he is talking against the Sunnis, and he is dividing the nation on the basis that the rulers are Sunnis and we, the people, are Shiites. So he's provoking this idea of the Shia Sunni, and this is the general trend which Iran principally is provocating, and I think the West is going along with it.
Okay, so I'm not entirely clear where you stand on this, because you seem to have sort of come around right to the beginning and said it is sectarian now. You'll have an opportunity to correct me if I'm wrong as we go along. Mohammad Marandi, what Sabah al Mukhtar is saying is the Sheikh was sectarian and that these guys want wilayat al-faqih, like the Iranian style of government. This is why there's a crackdown.
Well, first I'd like to critique the whole narrative, and that is that I don't believe that this is at all a Shia-Sunni conflict. This is a narrative that is used by countries like Saudi Arabia and the dictatorship in Bahrain to justify their rule. In fact, if anything, it is a Wahhabi regime or a Wahhabi-backed regime in Saudi Arabia that is propping up a dictatorship in Bahrain. And in fact, the Sheikh Isa Qasim, some of his allies during the uprising, which has lasted for a number of years now, they are Sunni, and he has never made any comments against the Sunni population. In fact, after the crushing of the uprising, I think roughly 4 years ago, the Bahraini regime set up a council to study what happened in the country, and the head of the council was actually British. So this was a Bahraini initiative. And the result was that there was no sign of Iranian involvement at all. So Iran is used as a justification for oppression. It's similar to what the Israelis do when they bomb Lebanon or when they bomb Gaza. They use Iran as a justification for
so
atrocities.
Mohammed, there was no...
For example, in the case of...
Sure, there was no evidence of this in 2011. They found that. However, let's look to this week. General Qasim Soleimani, the head of the Revolutionary Guards Corps, said Manama had crossed a red line and, quote, Al-Khalifa, the rulers of Bahrain, will definitely pay the price for that and their bloodthirsty regime will be toppled. This was after the citizenship was revoked of Sheikh Isa Qasim. So this is the man who's been seen on the ground in Syria, been seen on the ground in Iraq, commanding these Iranian forces. He's wading in now. Surely Iran's involved now. He said it. It's there in black and white, Mohammed.
No, actually, first of all, his involvement in Syria and in Iraq is with the permission of the officially recognized governments in these countries, the UN recognized governments. But with regards to Bahrain, he made a comment, and his comment was actually later on even further explained by Ayatollah Khamenei, the leader, and that was that Sheikh Isa Qasim is the most important figure in Bahrain. And he has been against violence. And up to now, he has been holding back the youth who are very angry. They're humiliated on a daily basis. They're killed, they're imprisoned. People have been imprisoned for many years. He's been keeping things calm. The foolishness of the regime is that they are trying to take away the citizenship of the person who's keeping things peaceful. And the only result will be that the younger generation will say, well, then it is useless to talk to the regime. It's useless to be peaceful, and that this will lead to violence.
But the people on the ground in Bahrain are saying, we want jobs, we want dignity, we want to be treated as equal citizens. What they want might not necessarily be matching what Iran wants, right?
Of course, but the description and the starting point of your program, it's talking about the Shiite in Bahrain, and that is where the fault is. The people in Bahrain are suffering because of the economy, because of the drop in oil prices, because of the dictatorship, because of the lack of laws, but not because they are Shiites, because they are people who are suffering there. So the government there is treating this situation, and you have the agents of Iran are riding on that wave by trying to divide the society into a Shiite and Sunni situation when we are talking about the minority rulers and all the rest of the discussion.
Let's take that little nugget that you said. You have the Iranians riding on that wave. So, Mohammed, if the Iranians weren't involved, they are going to get involved, and they're showing signs that they want to smuggle themselves into this and be the champion of the Bahraini protesters. Is that reasonable?
No, not at all. Not at all. The Iranians, if they wanted to get involved, they could have gotten involved over the last 5.5 years. And the Iranians are powerful enough to do that. So obviously that's not true. I think the problem is that this is a dictatorship. And it is a dictatorship that is trying to create a sectarian divide in order to justify its rule. It is a brutal regime, a family regime that has no legitimacy. And with regards to some of the statements that your guest made, I think that instead of looking to Saudi sources and Saudi media, to go to the Iranian media to see if any of these statements about occupying capitals and that sort of thing by the Persians has ever been said by any Iranian government official. That's all ridiculous.
I have heard it myself. I have heard it myself. I wasn't reading the Saudi one. I've heard it myself.
Who have you heard it from?
I heard it from the Speaker of the Parliament and one of the chiefs of the military forces in Iran. I have personally heard it.
No, you definitely did not hear that.
Okay.
And you're not, I doubt you're a Persian speaker anyway.
Bahrain is an ally of the United States. Despite the Iran deal, despite all of that, Bahrain's still a stable ally of the United States. There was a bipartisan report. The senators came out and said, maybe we should consider cutting aid to the Bahrainis because of human rights. Why do you think, Sabah, that President Barack Obama still fully supports the Bahraini monarchy?
Well, in the first instance, all the Western countries, Britain, the US, Europe, the Human Rights Council, the United States of America, they all condemned what happened to Sheikh Isa on the basis that he shouldn't have been stripped of his nationality. However, that is one aspect. The second aspect is the political situation. The U.S. is playing the role whereby they've handed Iraq to Iran. They've signed the treaty on the nuclear situation. And at the same time, they are maintaining their bases in Bahrain, UAE, and Qatar, and other regions. The U.S. is now content that Iran plays a role because they see Iran as the country which is fighting ISIS, which is the phobia that the West has, that there is no problem in the region except ISIS. And if you get ISIS off the map, then everything is going to be wonderful and everything is going to be good. And just one comment to make on
very
Iran.
briefly,
Iran's ambition on Bahrain is not new. The Shah wanted Iran there, and they had a referendum then.
Okay, Sabah al Mukhtar and Mohammad Marandi, gentlemen, it's been fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, forced to work, why millions are being denied the chance to have a normal childhood. And in Picture This, from the mayoral office to the presidential palace, Rodrigo Duterte is sworn in as the new leader of the Philippines. From boys working deep underground in mines to girls sewing clothes in factories, millions of children around the world are subjected to work. There's been some progress to stopping the practice. The UN says international standards have reduced child labor by about a third in the last decade. But agencies warn children are still widely employed and are urging businesses to ensure their supply chains are free from child labor. Christine Perovalakis reports.
Nag-practice po ako na siguro 6 years old po ako, nag-practice po ako magpa-berry. Hanggang yun na po ang naisip ko na pwedeng panghanap buhay para po may makain dito, makain po sa...
اسم عزیزالله 12 ساله یعنی 7 سال میشه که قالین کار منم 11 خوار براره خرج خانه بسته میز قالین بفروشم.
These kids don't go to school. They instead help make everything from smartphones to chocolate. The UN says more than 168 million children, or 1 in every 11 worldwide, risk sickness, injury, and even death to produce goods and services for the global economy.
From enterprises, we need a clear message of zero tolerance of child labour. They need to know what is happening in their supply chains.
The vast majority of child laborers are under the age of 14. 85 million children work in highly dangerous jobs like mining and construction in countries like Ghana, Mali, Tanzania, and the Philippines. And in dozens of countries, children are employed in tobacco fields where they're exposed to nicotine, pesticides, and extreme heat. More than 20% of all child laborers are in Africa, and there, almost 1 in 3 children have to work to help support their families. So with such economies dependent on children, trying to make positive changes is difficult. Earlier this year, one of the world's largest food manufacturers, Nestle, failed to get the U.S. Supreme Court to throw out a lawsuit seeking to make it liable for its suspected use of child labor. An independent study found that 2.1 million children, mostly under the age of 15, were working in cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast, and that Nestle was among the companies buying that cocoa. The case was brought forward by child victims from Mali. Human rights organization Amnesty has accused tech giants like Microsoft, Apple, and Vodafone of failing to conduct basic checks to ensure minerals used in their products are not being mined by children. It found that children as young as 7 work in dangerous conditions in the Democratic Republic of Congo to mine cobalt that ends up in smartphones, cars, and computers. And even the fashion industry is guilty of employing children to produce and sell clothing, from the cotton farms of Uzbekistan to the mills of India and the factories of Bangladesh. international standards now in place have reduced child labor by about a third in the last decade. But companies now have to eliminate the practice altogether.
If a business can subcontract its tax affairs to some remote destination, there is no excuse whilst they can't discover in their supply chains where their suppliers are using child labour.
But critics believe governments have the key responsibility of implementing regulations to stop companies from exploiting children. Christine Pirovoulakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss whether child labour can be stopped is Juliane Kippenberg. She's an Associate Director in the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Thanks very much for joining us, Juliane. 168 million children estimated to be involved here. That's an extraordinary number. Who actually needs to be held to account here, or should everybody be held to account?
Well, first and foremost, you really do need to look at the role of governments, because it's governments that have put in place laws, international treaties as well as national laws, and those are very strong and very good, and they prohibit that anyone under the age of 18 works in so-called hazardous child labor, as in particularly dangerous types of work, where, for example, children work at night or do dangerous work or are exposed to chemicals, for example. And it's those countries, of course, that should not only put these laws into place, but then, if they have done so, as they have done in almost all countries around the world, should obviously enforce these laws. And they're not doing that. And they're not doing enough to really ensure that children, particularly from very poor, underprivileged backgrounds, can really go to school instead of work.
Mm-hmm. Are there any grey areas when it comes to child labour? So looking at a country like Myanmar, for example, if somebody is 14, a shop assistant, treated well, earns money for the family, doesn't really have an opportunity to go to school, if asked personally, they'd prefer to stay in the job. Would that be considered child labour that needs to stop?
So under the international standards, 15 is the minimum age for work. So there is such legal work that you just described, work that isn't particularly dangerous, that doesn't actually put a child's development at risk, and that is completely legally accepted internationally from age 15. Now, there may be some exceptions to this, and there may be actually national law that allows the employment of children from the age of 14, but really lower than that is not really acceptable. And the reason for that is really that children should be going to school and getting an education. And in many, many cases, we see that children as young as even 6 or 7 years old do jobs that will ultimately trap them in poverty.
My final question for you, even though that number is massive, 168 million, UNI Global says child labour has been reduced by 1/3 in the past decade. That's something to celebrate, isn't it?
Absolutely. From our perspective, of course, this is the really good news, that globally the numbers of child labour, children in child labour are actually decreasing, and the numbers of children getting an education are increasing. But overall, we also have to see there's a lot of challenges ahead, and I just want to point out that it's not only governments that are, of course, responsible and have to take stronger measures to really ensure that children are not subjected to child labour and can go to school. But there is also a responsibility for businesses. When you look at the global market, there are many different products that are actually produced with the support, if you want, of child labor. This could be the clothes you wear, the cigarettes you smoke, the iPhone or smartphone you use, or other types of products that we don't know how they were produced. But in many cases, child labor actually plays a role. We have documented, for example, how children work in artisanal gold mining under extremely dangerous conditions, and that gold ultimately goes into the electronics, into the jewelry, and so on, that we actually buy. We've also documented, for example, child labor in leather tanneries, in tobacco, agriculture, farming, in other types of agriculture. So really all sorts of products. And it's really the companies that need to make sure that they don't have child labor in their supply chain. So they really need to put in place safeguards that go all the way down to the place of production.
Okay, Juliane Kippenberg from Human Rights Watch, thank you very much for joining us. In today's Picture This, a tough-talking former mayor, Rodrigo Duterte, has been sworn in as president of the Philippines. Let's take a look.
Just because you are a journalist, you are not exempted from assassination. If you are a son,
And that's all for this program. Today's Newsmaker was Bahrain, as we asked what's behind the renewed crackdown on opposition voices in the kingdom. Last week, a leading Shia cleric was stripped of his citizenship, accused of promoting sectarianism and violence. Iran has reacted very strongly to the decision, and many fear now that Bahrain could become another victim of regional tensions between Saudi Arabia and Tehran. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.